I'd always promised myself I'd learn Italian someday. Not for any grand reason. I wasn't planning to move to Rome or impress anyone at dinner parties. There was just something about the way the language flowed, the way it seemed to turn even the most mundane conversations into something musical. I'd catch fragments of it in movies or overhear tourists on the street, and I'd feel this strange pull, like hearing a song you can't quite remember but desperately want to know by heart. For years, I'd downloaded apps, bought dusty textbooks that lived unopened on my shelf, made half-hearted attempts at YouTube videos. But life always got in the way. Work deadlines, social obligations, the general chaos of being 25 and still figuring out what I was supposed to be doing with my existence. It wasn't until I moved to a new neighborhood that I finally stumbled across the community center's language program, tucked away on a bulletin board between advertisements for yoga classes and book clubs. Private Italian lessons, the small flyer read. Experienced tutor, flexible schedule, all levels welcome. I stared at it for longer than was probably normal, feeling something shift in my chest. This was it. This was my chance to finally follow through on something I'd been wanting for so long. The coordinator, a cheerful woman named Mrs. Chen, matched me with someone she described as one of our best tutors. Very patient, very dedicated. His name was Marco, she said, and he'd grown up bilingual, splitting his childhood between New York and Naples. When I asked about his teaching experience, she smiled in that way that suggested there was more to the story. He's been with us for 2 years now, she said, pulling out a thick binder filled with feedback forms. Students love him. He has this way of making people feel comfortable, like they're not being judged for their mistakes. I scheduled my first lesson for a Thursday evening after work. The community center was quieter then, with most of the day programs winding down and only a few dedicated night class students wandering the halls. Mrs. Chen led me to a small room on the second floor, more of a converted office than a proper classroom, with a round table, 2 chairs, and a whiteboard that had seen better days. He should be here any minute, she said, checking her watch. Don't be nervous. Marco's wonderful. I wasn't nervous exactly. Anxious, maybe. It had been a long time since I'd put myself in a learning situation like this, where my lack of knowledge would be so apparent. In college, I'd been good at languages, decent enough at French to get through my requirements without embarrassing myself. But Italian felt different. It felt personal in a way I couldn't quite explain. I was arranging my notebook and pens on the table when I heard footsteps in the hallway, followed by a soft knock on the doorframe. "Excuse me, are you David?" I looked up and felt my breath catch slightly. Marco wasn't what I'd expected, though I realized now I hadn't really formed any concrete expectations at all. He was maybe 28 or 29, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his hands through it and the kind of warm brown eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He wore a simple button-down shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and carried a worn leather messenger bag that looked like it had traveled half the world. But it was his voice that really caught me off guard. There was something musical about it, even in English, a subtle rhythm that hinted at the Italian underneath. When he said my name, it sounded different somehow, like he was offering me a gift I hadn't known I wanted. "That's me," I said, standing up perhaps a bit too quickly and extending my hand. "You must be Marco." His handshake was firm and warm, and he held my gaze while he smiled. "It's nice to meet you, David. Mrs. Chen told me you're interested in learning Italian." "Desperately," I said, then immediately felt heat rise to my cheeks. "I mean, yes, I've wanted to for a long time." He laughed, not at me, but with a kind of gentle amusement that made me feel like we were already sharing a joke. "Desperation is good. It means you're motivated." We settled into our chairs and I watched as Marco pulled out a small stack of materials from his bag. His movements were unhurried, deliberate. He arranged everything with the same careful attention I'd use for an important presentation, but there was something relaxed about it too. Like he was setting up for coffee with an old friend rather than a formal lesson. "So tell me," he said, leaning back slightly in his chair, "what draws you to Italian? What made you decide to finally take the leap?" I'd been prepared for this question. Mrs. Chen had warned me he might ask. But sitting across from Marco, I found myself stumbling over the rehearsed answer I'd planned. Well, I've always loved how it sounds," I began. "There's something about the way the words flow together. It's like music, you know?" Marco nodded, and I could see something shift in his expression. a kind of recognition, maybe. And I guess I've always been drawn to things that feel alive, languages that seem to have their own personality. I realized I was rambling and forced myself to stop. Sorry, that probably sounds ridiculous. No, Marco said, his voice softer now. It doesn't sound ridiculous at all. Italian is very much alive. It's a language that refuses to be contained, you know? Even when we try to follow all the rules, it finds ways to surprise us. He opened one of his notebooks, a small leather-bound thing with pages that looked soft from use, and I caught a glimpse of his handwriting. It was beautiful in that effortless way that made me suddenly self-conscious about my own cramped scrawl. His letters flowed across the page with the same musicality as his voice, each word looking like it belonged exactly where it was. "We'll start simple today," he said, writing something at the top of a fresh page. "Basic introductions, common phrases, just to get a feel for how the language sits in your mouth." He looked up at me, pen still poised over the paper. "Before we begin, though, I want you to know that this is a safe space. Making mistakes is how we learn. I'm not here to judge you or make you feel foolish. I'm here to help you discover something beautiful." The way he said it made my chest tighten unexpectedly. There was such sincerity in his voice, such gentle confidence. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "Good," he said, and began to write. "Let's start with Mi chiamo Marco. That means, my name is Marco." He pronounced it slowly, each syllable clear and precise, then repeated it again. When he said his own name in Italian, it sounded completely different, richer, more musical, like he was introducing me to someone I hadn't met before. "Your turn," he said. "Mi chiamo David." I tried to copy his pronunciation, but the words felt clumsy in my mouth. The R in particular seemed determined to trip me up. "Mi chiamo David?" I attempted, and immediately winced at how flat it sounded. Marco smiled. "Good start. Let's work on that chiamo. The ch is softer in Italian, like the K in key, but gentler. Listen." He repeated the word, and I found myself watching his mouth as he formed the sounds. There was something hypnotic about it, the way his lips and tongue moved to create these foreign shapes. "Try again," he encouraged. "Don't worry about getting it perfect. Just feel how it wants to move." I took a breath and tried again. "Mi chiamo David." "Better," Marco said, and I could hear genuine pleasure in his voice. "Much better. You're starting to feel the rhythm of it." For the next 40 minutes, we worked through basic phrases. Marco would write each one in his beautiful handwriting, demonstrate the pronunciation, then listen patiently as I stumbled through my attempts. He never rushed me, never showed any sign of frustration when I had to repeat something multiple times. Instead, he'd offer gentle corrections, suggestions for how to position my tongue or where to place emphasis. "The language has to become physical," he explained at one point when I was struggling with a particularly tricky combination of sounds. "It's not just intellectual. You have to let your mouth learn the shape of it." I was concentrating so hard on a phrase about ordering coffee that I didn't notice how close we'd gotten until Marco leaned in to point something out in my notebook. His shoulder brushed against mine and I caught a hint of his cologne. Something warm and slightly spicy, like cardamom and cedar. "See how this connects to this?" he said, his finger tracing a line between two words. "Italian loves to flow. It doesn't want to stop and start. It wants to pour." His voice was quieter now, meant just for me in this small space. I turned slightly to respond and realized our faces were only inches apart. For just a moment, I forgot what we were talking about, forgot what language we were speaking, forgot everything except the warmth of his proximity and the way he was looking at me. Then Marco straightened up, clearing his throat softly, and the moment passed. "Sorry," he said. "I sometimes get a bit enthusiastic about the language." "No, it's—" I started, then stopped. What was I going to say? That I liked having him close? That I'd suddenly understood what people meant when they talked about chemistry? "It's helpful, the explanation." We finished the lesson with Marco assigning me some basic exercises to practice. Simple phrases to repeat, common words to memorize. He tore a sheet from his notebook and wrote everything out in his careful script, adding little notes and pronunciation guides in the margins. "Don't try to be perfect," he said, handing me the paper. "Just practice letting the sounds happen naturally. Italian is forgiving that way." I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my notebook. Same time next week? Absolutely. Marco was packing up his materials, but he moved slowly, like he wasn't in any hurry to leave. You did very well today, David. I can tell you have good instincts for this. I felt like I was butchering half of it, I admitted. Everyone feels that way at first. He paused, looking at me directly. But you're not afraid to try, even when you're not sure. That's rarer than you might think. There was something in his tone that made me wonder if we were still talking about Italian. But before I could analyze it too much, he was shouldering his bag and heading toward the door. Arrivederci, David, he said with a smile. Until next week. Arrivederci, I attempted, and was rewarded with another one of his warm laughs. After he left, I sat in the small room for a few more minutes, looking at the notes he'd written for me. His handwriting was like a piece of art, each letter formed with care, each word given space to breathe. I found myself tracing the letters with my finger, trying to memorize not just the words but the way he'd chosen to shape them. The week that followed was strange. I found myself thinking about the lesson at odd moments. While making coffee in the morning, during boring meetings at work, lying in bed before falling asleep. I practiced the phrases Marco had given me, trying to recreate not just the sounds, but the feeling of them in my mouth. Sometimes I'd catch myself repeating his name the way he'd said it in Italian, just to hear how it sounded in my own voice. I told myself it was just excitement about finally learning something I'd wanted to learn for so long. That's all it was. Natural enthusiasm for a new skill. But Thursday evening couldn't come fast enough. When I arrived at the community center the following week, Marco was already there, setting up in our usual room. This time he'd brought a small Italian-English dictionary, its pages bookmarked with what looked like dozens of small strips of paper. Buonasera, David, he greeted me, and I felt a small thrill at understanding the meaning immediately. Buonasera, Marco, I replied, trying to match his intonation. Excellent, he said, and the genuine approval in his voice made me stand a little taller. You've been practicing. Every day, I admitted. Probably driving my neighbors crazy with my pronunciation drills. Marco laughed. That's the spirit. Today, we're going to build on what you learned last week and start working on some basic conversation. How does that sound? Terrifying, I said, but I was smiling. Good terrifying or bad terrifying? Good terrifying, I decided. I think. We began with a review of the previous week's material. Marco had me run through the basic phrases, offering corrections and encouragement in equal measure. I could hear the improvement in my own voice. The words were starting to feel less foreign, more like something I could actually imagine myself using in a real conversation. Much better, Marco said after I'd successfully navigated a series of introductions. You're starting to trust the language. I can hear it. He opened his notebook to a fresh page and began writing again. I'd started looking forward to this part of our lessons, watching him create these small works of art with his careful penmanship. Today, he was writing out questions and responses for basic conversations. Come ti chiami, he wrote, then looked up at me. How do you ask someone their name? Come ti chiami, I repeated, trying to capture the musical quality of his pronunciation. Perfect. And if someone asks you? Mi chiamo David. Excellent. Now, di dove sei? Where are you from? We worked through a series of questions and answers, building the foundation of small talk in Italian. Marco was patient as always, but I could sense a new energy in him today. He seemed more animated, more engaged. When I successfully completed a short exchange without any major errors, he leaned back in his chair with what looked like genuine pride. You're a natural at this, he said. I've had students who struggle for months with concepts you're picking up in weeks. I have a good teacher, I said, and immediately felt self-conscious about how earnest I sounded. But Marco didn't seem to mind. If anything, he looked pleased. Thank you. That means a lot. We were working on expressions of likes and dislikes when I completely mangled the pronunciation of mi piace molto. I like it very much. Instead of the smooth, flowing phrase Marco had demonstrated, what came out of my mouth sounded like a garbled mess of random syllables. Marco tried to keep a straight face. He really did. But when I attempted it a second time and somehow made it even worse, he lost the battle entirely. His laugh started as a small snort, then grew into something full and rich and completely unguarded. And then I was laughing too, partly at my own incompetence and partly at the wonderful absurdity of the sounds I'd just produced. We sat there giggling like teenagers who just heard their teacher curse, both of us completely abandoning any pretense of serious academic study. "I'm sorry," Marco said, wiping his eyes. "I shouldn't laugh at your pronunciation." "Are you kidding? You absolutely should. That was terrible." I was still grinning. "What did I even say?" "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure, but it was definitely not Italian." He picked up his pen again, still smiling. "Let's try breaking it down syllable by syllable. Me, that part you've got. PSA, let the A be longer, more open. Molto, soft like you're tasting something delicious." He demonstrated again, and I tried to focus on the mechanics of it, but I was distracted by how relaxed he looked. The laughter had done something to both of us, broken through some invisible barrier I hadn't even realized was there. "Better?" I asked after my next attempt. "Much better, though I have to say I'm going to miss your original version. It had character." "Character, right. That's one way to put it." We continued working, but something had shifted between us. The atmosphere felt lighter, less formal. Marco started making small jokes about Italian grammar rules, and I found myself sharing stories about my disastrous attempts to practice pronunciation in my apartment. When he leaned over to correct something in my notes, he stayed close a moment longer than necessary. When I reached for my water bottle and accidentally brushed against his hand, neither of us pulled away immediately. Near the end of our session, we were working on expressing preferences. Marco had written out a list of foods, activities, and interests, and was having me practice saying which ones I liked and disliked. "Mi piace la musica," I said, reading from his notes. "Good. What kind of music do you like? In English first, then we'll work on saying it in Italian." "Jazz mostly, some indie rock, classical when I'm trying to concentrate." I paused. "What about you?" "Everything," Marco said, "but especially Italian songwriters. Fabrizio De André, Francesco Guccini, Lucio Battisti. There's something about the way Italian handles melody. It's like the language was designed for singing." "Would you—" I started, then stopped. "Never mind." "What? Would you maybe play me something sometime so I can hear how it sounds?" Marco looked at me for a moment, something shifting in his expression. "I'd like that," he said quietly. "I'd like that very much." The way he said it made my chest tighten again. There was something in his voice, something that suggested we were talking about more than just music. We were running out of time, and Marco had started gathering his materials when I struggled with another phrase. This one was about expressing certainty, ne sono sicuro, meaning, "I'm sure of it." I kept stumbling over the flow of it, the way the words connected. "Here," Marco said, scooting his chair closer to mine. "Listen carefully. Ne sono sicuro." He said it slowly, deliberately, and I tried to copy him. But I was distracted by his proximity, by the way his knee was almost touching mine under the small table. "Try again," he said, his voice lower now. "But this time, don't think so much. Just let it happen." I attempted the phrase again, and this time I got closer. But there was still something not quite right about it. Marco leaned in even closer, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. "Listen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's softer here." He repeated the phrase, and I felt his breath against my ear. My heart started beating faster, and I had to concentrate on not shivering. "Try again," he murmured. "Ne sono sicuro," I whispered back, finally getting the flow of it right. "Perfect," Marco said, but he didn't move away immediately. For a moment we sat there, close enough that I could count his eyelashes if I wanted to, both of us breathing a little too carefully. Then he straightened up, clearing his throat, and the spell was broken. "You're learning fast," he said, his voice back to its normal volume. "Not just the words." Something about the way he said it made me look at him more closely. There was an intensity in his gaze that I hadn't noticed before, or maybe hadn't let myself notice. "What else am I learning?" I asked, surprised by my own boldness. Marco smiled, but it was different from his earlier smiles, more careful, more weighted with meaning. "That's something you'll have to figure out for yourself." We finished packing up our materials in comfortable silence. As we prepared to leave, Marco handed me my practice sheet for the week, More beautiful handwriting, more careful notes in the margins. Same time next week? He asked. Wouldn't miss it, I said. We walked out of the building together, lingering on the front steps even though it was getting cold. The community center was almost empty now, just a few cars scattered across the parking lot under the yellow streetlights. Thank you, I said, for being so patient with me. Marco looked at me for a long moment, his hands buried in his coat pockets. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, thoughtful. Patience isn't hard, he said, holding my gaze a little too long. When it's with you. The words hung in the air between us, loaded with something I couldn't quite name but could definitely feel. I wanted to respond, to say something equally meaningful, but my throat had gone dry. Marco seemed to realize what he'd said, and I watched a faint flush creep up his neck. I mean, you're a good student, he added quickly. Motivated. That makes all the difference. But the clarification felt hollow, like he was taking back something he'd meant to say. Right, I said, not quite believing either of us. Well, good night, Marco. Buonanotte, David, he replied. And even in my limited Italian, I could hear the warmth in the farewell. I watched him walk to his car, a small blue sedan parked under one of the streetlights. He turned back once before getting in, raising a hand in a small wave, and I waved back like an idiot, still standing on the steps long after he'd driven away. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the lesson. The way Marco had laughed at my terrible pronunciation, the warmth of his shoulder against mine, the whispered correction that had sent shivers down my spine, the way he'd looked at me when he said patience wasn't hard when it was with me. It was supposed to be a lesson, but when he looked at me, it felt like he was teaching me something I didn't even know I needed. I tried to tell myself I was reading too much into things, that Marco was just a naturally warm person, that Italian culture was more affectionate than what I was used to, that I was projecting feelings that weren't really there. But even as I tried to rationalize it away, I knew something had changed between us. In the space of 2 lessons, something had shifted, some invisible line had been crossed. I wasn't sure what it meant or where it was leading, but I knew I wanted to find out. I reached over to my nightstand and picked up the practice sheet Marco had given me, running my fingers over his careful handwriting in the darkness. Tomorrow I would practice these phrases, memorize these words, try to make my mouth form these foreign shapes, but tonight, I just held the paper like a secret, like a promise of something I was only beginning to understand. Outside my window, the city hummed with its usual late-night energy, but inside my small apartment, everything felt different, like I was standing at the edge of something vast and uncharted, something that had nothing to do with conjugating verbs or mastering pronunciation, something that had everything to do with the way Marco had said my name, the way he'd leaned close to correct my accent, the way he'd looked at me when he said patience wasn't hard when it was with me. I fell asleep with his words echoing in my mind, with the phantom warmth of his proximity still lingering on my skin, wondering what next Thursday would bring, and whether I was brave enough to find out. Part 2. The third week changed everything, though I didn't realize it at the time. I arrived at the community center 15 minutes early, partly because I'd been restless all day and partly because I'd started looking forward to these lessons with an intensity that probably wasn't entirely healthy. I told myself it was just enthusiasm for learning, but sitting in that small room waiting for Marco, I couldn't ignore the way my pulse quickened when I heard footsteps in the hallway. When Marco appeared in the doorway, he looked different somehow. More relaxed, maybe, or less guarded. He wore a soft gray sweater that made his eyes look even warmer, and when he smiled at me, it felt like something I got to keep. Buonasera, David, he said, setting his bag down with that same unhurried care I'd come to associate with him. Buonasera, Marco, I replied, and was pleased when he nodded approvingly at my pronunciation. You've been practicing, he observed, pulling out his materials. I can hear the confidence growing. We started with our usual review, but something felt different tonight. Marco seemed more talkative, asking questions that went beyond simple language exercises. When we were working on describing daily activities, he asked me what I did for work, what I liked to do on weekends, whether I had family nearby. His questions felt genuine, less like a teacher gathering information and more like someone who actually wanted to know. I work in marketing, I told him, practicing the Italian phrase for lavoro nel marketing. It's not exactly my passion, but it pays the bills while I figure out what I really want to do. And what do you really want to do? Marco asked, switching to English with an easy naturalness. I hesitated. It wasn't something I talked about much, this vague sense that I was supposed to be doing something more meaningful with my life. I'm not sure exactly. Something creative, maybe? I used to write in college, stories, essays, that kind of thing. But after graduation, it felt like such an impractical dream. Marco nodded thoughtfully. In Italian, we have an expression, il cuore sa quello che la mente ignora. The heart knows what the mind ignores. He wrote it out in his careful script, and I found myself studying not just the words but the way his pen moved across the page. That's beautiful, I said. Is it from something specific? My nonna used to say it, my grandmother. She was full of phrases like that, little pieces of wisdom disguised as poetry. Marco's smile was softer now, more distant. She believed that people always know what they really want deep down. They just convince themselves they don't because wanting something and not having it is too painful. Do you think that's true? Marco looked at me directly, and I felt that familiar tightness in my chest. I'm starting to. We continued with the lesson, but the conversation had opened something between us. When we moved on to talking about family, Marco shared stories about growing up between two cultures, about summers in Naples with his grandmother, about learning to navigate the differences between his Italian relatives and his American classmates. It was confusing sometimes, he said, feeling like I belonged completely in both places and neither place at the same time. The language was the bridge, though. Italian when I needed to connect with one part of myself, English for the other. Is that why you teach it? I asked. To help other people build bridges? Marco paused, his pen hovering over the notebook. Maybe. Or maybe I just like watching people discover that they can be more than one thing at once. The way he said it made me wonder if we were still talking about language. Our fourth lesson was derailed almost immediately. We'd planned to work on past tense constructions, but somehow we got sidetracked talking about music. I'd mentioned that I'd been listening to some of the Italian artists Marco had recommended, and he'd lit up with such genuine enthusiasm that I couldn't bring myself to redirect us back to grammar exercises. Which song did you try first? He asked, abandoning his lesson plan entirely. La Canzone del Sole by Battisti. I couldn't understand most of the words, but there was something about the melody. That one breaks everyone's heart, Marco said, leaning back in his chair. It's about morning light, about waking up next to someone and realizing that the day is going to be beautiful because they're in it. He hummed a few bars under his breath, and I felt something flutter in my stomach at the sound. Would you translate some of it? I asked. So I know what I'm listening to? Marco pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing. Not the careful lesson notes I was used to, but something more fluid, more personal. He wrote out verses in Italian and then English translations below, occasionally pausing to hum the melody or explain a particular phrase. This line here, he said, pointing to a section he'd just written, Che bella giornata di sole. What a beautiful sunny day. But in Italian, bella can mean beautiful or lovely or dear. And giornata isn't just day, it's the experience of a day, the feeling of it passing. I found myself leaning closer to see his writing, to follow his finger as it traced across the words. We were sitting side by side now, both of us focused on the paper between us, and I was acutely aware of the space where our shoulders almost touched. The music changes the meaning too, Marco continued, his voice quieter now. When Battisti sings it, you can hear that he's not just talking about the weather. He's talking about how love makes everything brighter. Have you ever felt like that? I asked, then immediately wondered if I'd overstepped some boundary. But Marco didn't seem bothered by the question. He considered it seriously, his fingers drumming silently against the table. Once, he said finally. A long time ago. What happened? I was young, afraid. I thought I had more time to figure things out. He looked at me, and there was something vulnerable in his expression. I let fear make decisions that should have been made with courage. I wanted to ask more, but something in his tone suggested the conversation was over. Instead, we spent the rest of the session going through more song lyrics, Marco translating and explaining while I tried to memorize not just the words, but the way he said them, the way his voice softened on certain phrases. When it was time to leave, I realized we hadn't touched a single grammar exercise. But I'd learned more about Italian and about Marco than in any of our previous sessions combined. I'm sorry we got so off track, Marco said as we packed up our things. I'm not, I said, and meant it. He smiled at that, one of his real smiles that seemed to start in his eyes. Next week, we should probably actually study some grammar. Probably, I agreed. But this was better. The fifth lesson happened during a thunderstorm. I'd been watching the weather all day, worried that the rain might keep one of us away. But when Thursday evening came, I drove through the downpour anyway, unable to bear the thought of missing our session. The community center was nearly empty, most of the evening classes canceled due to the weather. I found Marco already in our usual room, but tonight it felt different. The overhead fluorescent light was off, replaced by a small desk lamp that cast everything in warm golden tones. The sound of rain drummed against the windows, punctuated by distant rolls of thunder that made the small space feel even more intimate. I hope you don't mind, Marco said when I arrived, gesturing to the lamp. The fluorescent was flickering. I thought this might be easier on our eyes. It's perfect, I said, and realized I meant it. The soft lighting made everything feel more personal, less like a classroom and more like something else. Something I couldn't quite name. We settled into our usual spots, but the storm seemed to affect both of us. Our voices were naturally lower, more careful, as if we were trying not to disturb the rhythm of the rain. When thunder rumbled overhead, we'd both pause, listening, before continuing. Tonight I want to teach you something different, Marco said, writing something new in his notebook. These are words for emotions, feelings. They're some of the most important vocabulary you can learn. He wrote out a list. Amore, gioia, tristezza, paura, speranza. Love, joy, sadness, fear, hope. In Italian, emotions aren't just abstract concepts, he explained, his voice barely above a whisper. They're physical things. You don't just feel love, senti amore. You carry it. You live it. The language treats feelings like they have weight and substance. He had me practice each word, correcting my pronunciation with that same gentle attention I'd grown to crave. But tonight felt different, more charged. When he leaned close to demonstrate the soft R in amor, I found myself staring at his lips, watching the way they formed the sounds I was trying to learn. Try it again, he murmured. Amore. Amore, I repeated, and something about the way the word felt in my mouth, combined with the intimacy of the lamplight and the sound of rain, made my heart race. Marco's eyes met mine, and for a moment neither of us moved. The air between us felt thick with possibility, with things neither of us was quite ready to say. Good, he said finally, his voice rough around the edges. Very good. We moved through the other words on the list, but I was distracted by the growing awareness that something was happening between us. Something that had nothing to do with vocabulary and everything to do with the way Marco's breath caught when our hands accidentally brushed as we reached for the same page. The way he kept glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking. The way my name sounded different when he said it in this soft light. Language is about connection, Marco said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled over us. Sometimes the words aren't even the most important part. What is the most important part? I asked. Marco set down his pen and looked at me directly. Understanding. Being willing to be understood. The thunder chose that moment to crash overhead, close enough to make the windows rattle, and we both jumped slightly. Then we laughed at our own reaction, but the laughter felt nervous, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Are you afraid of storms? Marco asked. Not afraid exactly, but they make me aware of how small we are, how little control we actually have. I love them, Marco said. The drama, the power, the way they change the air, make everything feel electric. As if to prove his point, another crack of thunder rolled across the sky, and this time I didn't jump. Instead, I found myself thinking about electricity, about the charged atmosphere in our small room, about the way Marco was looking at me like he was seeing something new. We tried to get back to the lesson, but the storm had unsettled both of us in ways that made concentration difficult. Finally, Marco closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. Can I ask you something personal? He said. I nodded, not trusting my voice. What made you want to learn Italian? Really? Not the answer you gave me the first day, but the real reason. I considered lying, giving him some safe explanation about career goals or travel plans. But something about the intimacy of the lamplight, the honesty he'd been showing me, made me want to tell the truth. I wanted to be the kind of person who spoke Italian, I said slowly. Does that make sense? I wanted to be someone who had that kind of beauty in their life, that kind of passion. I thought maybe if I learned the language, I could learn how to be that person too. Marco was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving mine. And are you becoming that person? I don't know yet, I said. But I'm starting to think maybe I already was. Maybe I just needed permission to believe it. Who gives us permission for things like that? I looked at him, at the way the lamplight caught the gold flecks in his brown eyes, at the gentle curve of his mouth, at the way he was sitting forward in his chair like my answer mattered more than anything else in the world. Sometimes other people do, I said quietly. When they see something in us that we can't see in ourselves. The rain continued to drum against the windows, creating a cocoon of sound around us. Marco reached across the table, ostensibly to point out something in his notebook, but when his fingers brushed against mine, neither of us pulled away. David, he said, my name barely audible above the storm. Yeah? I need you to know that this… He gestured between us, at the small space we occupied, at the way we were looking at each other. This isn't something I do, with students. I know, I said, though I wasn't sure I did know anything anymore except that my heart was beating so loud I was sure he could hear it. I should probably keep things more professional. Probably, I agreed, but neither of us moved. Neither of us pulled away. We sat there with our hands almost touching, with the storm raging outside and something equally powerful building between us, both of us pretending we were still talking about Italian lessons. Our sixth lesson was the one that changed everything. I arrived to find Marco already setting up, but he seemed different tonight. More nervous, maybe, or more purposeful. He'd brought different materials, not the usual textbooks and grammar exercises, but a small collection of what looked like handwritten notes and photocopied pages from books. I thought tonight we could work on something more advanced, he said without looking up. Poetry. Italian poetry. Poetry? I repeated, settling into my chair. Isn't that pretty ambitious for someone who still can't properly roll their R's? Marco smiled, but it was a different kind of smile than usual, more careful, more weighted with intention. Poetry isn't about perfect pronunciation, he said. It's about feeling, about understanding that language can be beautiful even when it's imperfect. He handed me a sheet of paper with a poem written in his careful handwriting. Below the Italian text, he'd written an English translation, but I could tell from the way the lines were arranged that something was lost in the translation, some rhythm or music that could only exist in the original language. This is by Eugenio Montale, Marco said, one of Italy's greatest poets. This particular poem, it's about longing, about the space between what we want and what we think we can have. I read through the Italian text, recognizing some words but missing most of the meaning. When I looked up, Marco was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Will you read it to me? I asked. So I can hear how it's supposed to sound? Marco nodded and took the paper from my hands, his fingers lingering against mine for just a moment longer than necessary. When he began to read, his voice took on a different quality, richer, more musical, like he was singing instead of speaking. Non chiederci la parola che squadri da ogni lato l'animo nostro informe, e a lettere di fuoco lo dichiari e risplenda come un crocco perduto in mezzo a un polveroso prato. I closed my eyes and just listened, letting the sounds wash over me. I didn't understand all the words, but I understood the emotion behind them, something yearning and beautiful and slightly desperate. What does it mean? I asked when he finished. Marco set the paper down and looked at me directly. It's asking someone not to demand words that can perfectly explain the formless nature of our souls. It's saying that some things are too complex, too personal to be captured in language. But he wrote a poem about it, so he did find words. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the trying is what matters, even when the words aren't enough. Marco picked up his pen and wrote something new on a fresh sheet of paper. When he slid it across to me, I saw he'd written a single phrase in Italian. Ti voglio bene. This is something I haven't taught you yet, he said quietly. It's difficult to translate directly. In English, you might say, I care about you, or I wish you well. But in Italian, It's more than that. It's deeper. How is it deeper? Marco leaned forward, his elbows on the table, and I found myself mirroring his posture until we were close enough that I could see the individual flecks of gold in his eyes. Ti voglio bene means I want good things for you. I want your happiness. I want your well-being. It's it's what you say to someone when they matter to you in a way that goes beyond simple friendship, but isn't quite the same as romantic love. Though, he added, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, sometimes it can be a step toward that too. My throat felt tight. And when would someone say this? When they've been spending time with someone who makes them remember why language is beautiful, when they find themselves looking forward to seeing that person in a way that feels dangerous and wonderful at the same time. Marco's eyes never left mine. When they realize they've been teaching someone vocabulary but learning something entirely different in return. I swallowed hard. What have you been learning? That connection doesn't require perfect grammar. That some of the most important conversations happen in the spaces between words. That patience isn't a virtue when what you really want is courage. The air between us felt electric, charged with possibility and promise, and the weight of things we weren't quite saying. I was acutely aware of everything, the sound of our breathing, the warmth radiating from Marco's skin, the way his gaze kept dropping to my mouth and then back to my eyes. Marco, I started, but I wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. I know, he said softly. I know. We sat in that charged silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Outside, the world continued its normal rhythm, but inside our small room, time felt suspended. Finally, Marco straightened up, breaking the spell, and I felt the loss of his proximity like a physical ache. We should probably work on pronunciation, he said, his voice not quite steady. Right, pronunciation. But when Marco had me practice Ti voglio bene, when he corrected the subtle vowel sounds and showed me how to let the words flow together, it felt less like a language lesson and more like a confession. Each repetition was a small act of courage, a step closer to something I wasn't sure I was brave enough to name. Better, Marco said after my third attempt. But remember, it's not just about the sounds. It's about the intention behind them. What should my intention be? Marco looked at me for a long moment. That depends on what you're trying to say. The lesson continued, but everything felt different now. Every word we practiced seemed loaded with double meaning. Every correction felt like an excuse for closeness. Every glance was a small conversation we were having without words. It wasn't just language he was teaching me. It was the possibility of being understood. When our time was up, I gathered my books and papers with reluctant care, not wanting the evening to end. Marco was packing up too, but more slowly than usual, like he was also looking for reasons to linger. Same time next week? I asked. The question I'd been asking for weeks, but that now felt heavy with new significance. Actually, Marco said, then stopped. He seemed to be wrestling with something, some decision he wasn't sure he should make. Actually, I wanted to ask you something. I waited, my books clutched against my chest like armor. There's a small Italian film festival happening downtown this weekend. Just one night, 3 movies with subtitles. I thought, if you were interested, it might be good practice, hearing the language in context. My heart started beating faster. Are you asking me to go with you? Yes, Marco said simply. I'm asking you to go with me. It wasn't a date exactly, but it wasn't not a date either. It was something in between, something that existed in the same liminal space we'd been occupying for weeks. I'd like that, I said. I'd like that a lot. Marco's smile was radiant, transforming his whole face. Good. It's Saturday at 7. I can pick you up if you want. That would be perfect. We stood there for another moment, both of us holding our bags and grinning at each other like teenagers who'd just figured out their crush liked them back. Ti voglio bene, David, Marco said softly, and this time when he said it, there was no mistaking it for a vocabulary lesson. Ti voglio bene anch'io, Marco, I replied, hoping I'd gotten the grammar right, but knowing that the meaning was clear regardless. We walked out of the building together, but when we reached the parking lot, Marco stopped beside his car and turned to face me. David, he said, my name carrying more weight than it ever had before. Yeah? There's one word I haven't taught you yet. His voice was quiet, careful, like he was approaching something fragile. But maybe it's better if I show you instead. The words hung between us, an invitation and a promise and a question all at once. Marco took a step closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne, close enough that I could see my own reflection in his eyes. I felt my book slip from my hands as every rational thought disappeared, replaced by the sudden, overwhelming awareness that we were standing at the edge of something that would change everything. That after weeks of circling around each other, of finding excuses to touch and reasons to linger, we were finally about to cross the line we'd been dancing around. "Show me," I whispered, and the words felt like the most important thing I'd ever said in any language. Marco's hand came up to cup my face, his thumb brushing across my cheekbone with a tenderness that made my knees weak. He was looking at me like I was something precious, something he'd been waiting for longer than either of us realized. And then the world narrowed down to just the two of us standing in that parking lot under the streetlights, with all the words we'd learned and all the words we'd never needed hanging in the air between us, waiting. E